You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Time's on my mind when I had you by my side. Am I thinking loud? Do I want you around? Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction. In the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week. Yes, I am laughing. I was just talking to Karina, the producer, who presses all the buttons to ensure we're on the community radio network, and we did have a little bit of a laugh at my expense, not yours, obviously, because we don't know who you are. It could be anybody listening. That's the great thing about broadcasting. Anybody, anywhere in the world, via the World Wide Web and the Community Radio Network, could be listening to Anarchist World This Week at any time. Because the program, unfortunately, is podcast. And if you miss out, you can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. Well, anarchos without rulers, what gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people? Inequalities in power and wealth. So what's the anarchist struggle? The anarchist struggle is to devolve, share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. So unlike parliamentary democracy, anarchism is about creating a society for the good of the many, not the few. Extraordinary. What a conservative concept. You would wonder why human beings haven't, caught up with the idea that their future lies in their ability to work collectively and constructively with the people around them, not following some cult figure, some religious guru, some president, some dictator. I mean, you would think that after almost, 250,000 years of evolution, that we would have learnt that simple lesson. That's inequalities in power and wealth, which create most of the issues which we face today. Now, if you're like I am, and you're a little bit interested in the past, because, history didn't start this morning, as we think in Australia. I mean, that's the dilemma with Australian society. History starts every morning, doesn't it? It's a little bit like Groundhog Day. Nothing that's happened before really matters. The reality is that we are a product of the past, whether we like it or not. And I'm interested in the concept of parliamentary democracy, and I'd like to look at that today because it has huge ramifications, and in many regards, the failures of parliamentary democracy explain the situation we find ourselves in 2024, where for the first time in a long time in this country, future generations will not be enjoying the spoils of living in a parliamentary democracy. Now, those of you who are familiar with parliamentary democratic history, you can go back some way, but the interesting thing, it's about representation. And if you look at the old Chartist manifesto, which was adopted in May 1838 by the Chartists, which is basically a working class movement in England. The manifesto had 6 points. They called it the People's Charter. We all know the Magna Carta was the Nobles' Charter, when the nobles were able to constrain the royal prerogative, which came from God to the king or the queen. But the People's Charter was an attempt to create a People's Charter, and it was based on 6 principles: universal male suffrage for any male over 21, equal constituencies, payment of parliamentary members, because obviously you couldn't be a parliamentarian and work at the same time, although some people did. Secret ballot. That's right. The secret ballot was exceptionally important. So equal constituency, parliamentary, blah, blah, blah. But the interesting thing is point 6, which nobody actually looks at. And point 6 is they wanted annual parliaments. And if you look at the original documentation and the original leaflets, it explains why they are concerned about the limitations of parliamentary democracy. They were concerned because they were concerned about bribery and intimidation of representatives. Because it's one thing to promise something, it's another thing to, try to deliver that promise. So parliamentary democracy, where it exists today, and it is a shrinking political ideology or philosophy, whatever you like to call it, or movement, is based on the simple concept of representation. The people elect a representative, usually from some type of political grouping with similar ideas, to make decisions for them over the next 3, 4, 5 years, depending where you find yourself in the globe. So it's about representation. It's not about direct democracy. It's basically what I call a single-cell organism as far as democracy is concerned. It's a very primitive form of democracy. So why do we find ourselves in 2024 in a situation where totalitarianism and totalitarian leaders, whether self-appointed through the barrel of a gun or elected by the people they represent, have become such a feature of a so-called democratic process? And the whole point about parliamentary democracy, it's supposed to deliver the greatest good for the greatest number of people. I'll explain that again. Democracy is about delivering the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Well, that's the philosophy. So what's happened? What's happened during the 19th century in societies or sovereign nation states which have relied on a representative democracy? Well, what has happened is that the very, very fears of the Chartists almost 200 years ago have come to fruition. And the idea that democracy should deliver the greatest good to the greatest number has gone out the door, if it ever existed in the first place. And what we have seen is the democratic process or representation, representative democracy, being colonised. It's a lovely word, being colonised. Comes from the colon. Being colonised by the very people that the parliamentary system was created to control. So what we see in 2024 is a direct reversal of the parliamentary system of creating the greatest good for the greatest number. And what we're seeing is the creation of the greatest good for fewer and fewer and fewer people. And this process has been accelerated around the world over the last half a century by 4 distinct principles, which I, talk about week in, week out. Privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation, deregulation. And I'll define these principles. Privatisation is about giving the public sphere to the private sector. And we've seen it ad nauseum in this country. Those of you who are wondering about your electricity and gas bills, maybe the situation wouldn't have been so difficult if these institutions hadn't been privatised by parliamentary democracies. And I could talk about the privatisation of the ports, the airports, the healthcare system, superannuation, it just goes on and on. Then you've got corporatisation, and all you've got to do is walk into a major shopping mall and all you'll see is the same corporate signage everywhere. Then you've got globalisation, which means, trying to get the cheapest labour costs available to you. And then you've got deregulation, removing all those regulations which were set in place to protect people. Very simple concepts. So what's happened is the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. Don't forget communication. Now dictate parliamentary policy. It's not as if they tap the Prime Minister or the Deputy Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition on the shoulder and say, this is what you need to do. It's much more subtle and more complex than that. What happens is that when legislation is proposed that dilutes their power and encroaches, I like that, well, they are roaches, encroaches on their profits, then all hell breaks loose. Whether it's the new virtual platforms, which are about getting your eyeballs on things to make a buck, or whether it's the legacy media, all hell breaks loose, irrespective of how minor the reforms that are proposed. And that legislation is never drawn up because it means political death for that particular group. And obviously the Australian Labor Party and the Greens, especially the Australian Labor Party, have come to an understanding that if they wish to remain in power, they need to promote policies that benefit the few while trying to introduce legislation that may benefit people. So we find ourselves, not just in this country, we find ourselves, people feel disenfranchised. For example, I know you're all jumping up and down about the great Labor victory in England or Great Britain. The fact is only 60% of the Brits actually went to the polls. And with the USA elections, coming up in November, you'd be lucky to get 30 to 40% vote for the Congress or the Senate, and maybe 50, possibly 60% vote for the presidential election. So when some leader who's got resources behind them, like Mr. Trump, starts talking about the fact that people have been left behind, but not offering any solutions of how to pull people out of that situation, then people listen, irrespective of how gobbledygook the message is. Because if you live in a society where you are constantly told that you have power, and when you see that you have no power and that nothing ever seems to change, and that power and profits continue to be entrusted to a shrinking minority, people begin to look for scapegoats. Why do I find myself in this situation? And it's exceptionally easy to look at somebody who speaks a different language, different sexuality, different gender, I don't know, different colour, wears a funny hat. It's exceptionally easy to be able to create political and social movements which are based on the idea that if we remove these people from our society, somehow life will be better. Somehow we'll be able to share in the Commonwealth. It is the Commonwealth of Australia, don't forget. Somehow we won't have 1 million children living in poverty in this country, or is it 1.5 million these days? Somehow we won't be mortgaging our future for the next 30 to 40 to 50 years with intergenerational mortgages to get a bit of a secure roof over our heads. Somehow I'm not going to be fired. And the list goes on and on. So obviously, the death of parliamentary democracy is not related to the idea that democracy should create the greatest good for the greatest number, but the death of parliamentary democracy, and it is dying on the vine, the death of parliamentary democracy and the way it is manipulated and the way it has been usurped by that that 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication is directly linked to the rise of political groups and movements which are based on alienating and marginalising minorities. Because it's very easy to point a finger at a minority, and we've done it over and over and over again in this country. But obviously, as we all woke up this morning, history only started this morning, so we don't have to worry about the past, do we? So, who killed the goose that laid the golden egg? Well, the first thing is the structures which were set up to create the greatest good for the greatest number is not working. And irrespective of who leads that sovereign nation state, irrespective of the New Deal which is promised, the fact is that we're dealing from the same old pack of cards. So it's time that parliamentary democracy was put through the ringer and that we look at different ways of actually creating democratic structures in this country. And those democratic structures are based on one simple principle, the greatest good for the greatest number, while at the same time protecting the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. Because democracy is not about the rule of the majority. The majority can be very cruel. And if there are no constitutional protections for the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power, and there isn't in the Australian Constitution, if people agreed, I know this sounds ridiculous, in both the Senate and the lower house, that 2-year-old blue-eyed children are the spawn of the devil and they should be deported, well, that would happen. So, think about it. Think about the type of society create. Think about why we find ourselves in this situation, and don't be fooled into thinking that it's the other. That's the problem. The problem is the very structures that have allowed power and wealth to be concentrated in so few hands. And I say this every week, almost every week. 30 years ago, if you were an investor, invested $1 and you made $1, 33% of that buck would come to you and the rest would go to the workers who made that profit for you. Today, it's the other way around. No wonder the biggest group of people, and the smallest group, I should say, both together, the growing group, the growing number of millionaires, which is you can't even buy a house with $1 million these days, and billionaires. So you're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. Now, the thing is, I'm not here to depress you. I'm here to try to present an analysis of what's happening around us and try to explain what's happening. If you told me when I started off on this journey when I was, 16, 17, almost, 60 years ago, or 55 years ago, that I would be finding myself in the situation I find myself in as far as Australian society is concerned, I would have called you all fools. But the fact is that what we have seen is the very thing we were arguing against and struggling against in the 1960s and 1970s, the centralisation of power and wealth. And the thing is, to a large degree, it's our own fault. It's your fault, it's my fault, it's the community's fault. Because we have believed, hook, line and sinker, that the way forward is through a private investment for private profit model. We have knelt in front of Mammon and we have believed the propaganda. Although we have lost our belief, many of us, in the Bible or the Quran or the Vedas or whatever, the fact is there is one common belief in this country. And that belief has been for so long that the way forward is through a private investment for private profit mantra. And the dilemma is that in a society where we rely on the private sector to create a profit, to provide essential and basic services to the population as a whole, we find this situation where wealth and power tends to be concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Now, I have a very soft spot for small business, unlike many radicals in this country. Now, small business people, not just wage earners and people on social security benefits, but small business people who just run a business with 1 or 2 employees or just themselves and their families, they somehow believe the way forward is to support the current system. And the dilemma is they've been squeezed out of business. 90% of small businesses fail within 5 years of being created because of corporatisation, because unregulated competition, as we have in this country, means that what you do is you create bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger corporations. So if you want to go to a hardware store, there's one name pops up in your mind. If you want to go to a food store, 3 or 4 names pop up in your mind. And that's the dilemma. So, change is possible. If I didn't think change was possible, I wouldn't be wasting my time talking to 4 walls. I wouldn't be wasting my time. I mean, I've been broadcasting here on Community Radio 3CR for almost 50 years. I think about 47. And I've been broadcasting via the Community Radio Network, I think, for about 20 years. So while, as a volunteer, would I be wasting my time if I didn't think change was possible? You see, change comes, and this is what history's about. If you look at history, you look at all the great historical moments, the moments where change occurred. Did change come because somebody gave you something? Did change come because you begged and beseeched and you scraped and and crawled? Did change come because you were happy to see a few crumbs being swept off the corporate table? Change comes when ordinary people have had enough. When ordinary people make extraordinary sacrifices. That's when change comes. Change doesn't come when ordinary people think that some guru, some leader, some ruler is going to save their bacon. My apology to all those pigs out there. But save their bacon. Change doesn't come. You've got revolutions and you've got social revolutions. A social revolution is a revolution that turns everything on its head, especially the concept that a private investment for private model, private investment for private profit model is the only way forward. It is in the anarchist world this week, and as I keep thinking to myself, there's a lot of ordinary people listening to this program, and many of them have made extraordinary sacrifices and will continue to make extraordinary sacrifices to ensure that change comes. The word revolution comes from the word revolve. Things come and go. Human beings experiment with different ways of organising themselves. And there are periods in human history where people have had enough. And we are now approaching that period. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Network. This program is streamed to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne, 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Look, have you noticed how the Gaza carnage continues? What is it, 9 months? You know, still waging war. The Israeli Defence Forces still waging war in an area half the size of Melbourne, the size of Canberra, with, all the latest sophisticated bombs and, while 2 million people are crisscrossing, trying to save themselves and their children. And I'm sure you're sick and tired of all those pictures of the suffering which is occurring in Gaza, courtesy of the Israeli Defence Forces, those little body bags that people are carrying of little kiddies that have been blown to bits. I could all be, I could make this, make it all emotional. But the fact is, we've almost had 40,000 people die in Gaza. But what I find extraordinary is a war criminal. The International Court in The Hague has designated Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as a war criminal. Okay? They don't often designate world leaders as war criminals. But he has been designated as a war criminal. And guess what this war criminal is doing this week? He has been hosted by the United States of America. He will be visiting the White House to speak to Mr. Biden, to speak to Mr. Trump. And most importantly of all, and this is what I find extraordinary, is he has been invited, this is a indicted war criminal, has been invited to address the United States Senate and Congress. Could you imagine the fuss that would occur if Pol Pot or Stalin had been invited to address the United States Senate and Congress? Or Mussolini? Let's forget about Mr. Hitler, he's beyond the pale. What an extraordinary world we live in. An indicted war criminal invited to meet the President of the United States, the so-called President-in-waiting of the United States, and address the Senate and the Congress in the United States about the carnage in Gaza. Now, I know a number of Hamas leaders have also been designated as war criminals, but I haven't noticed that they've been given an invitation to the US Senate and Congress. And I've noticed that Mr. Biden, the US President, has been jumping up and, shuffling up and down, to the carnage in Gaza to end, and it hasn't ended. And I've noticed that the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza, and it hasn't happened. And I've noticed that when a drone from Yemen hits Tel Aviv and one Israeli citizen is killed, and that it's world news. But when another 70 or 80 Gazans or Palestinian Gazans are blown to bits, well, it's just a full stop. We get on with our lives, don't we? The carnage continues. We continue to provide the bombs, the logistics, the military aid, and even allow a war criminal. The United States even allows an indicted war criminal to actually address the Senate and the Congress. What a wonderful world we live in. My apologies to poor old Louis Armstrong. He'd be turning his grave. What a wonderful world we live in. Now, those of you who've been following the CFMEU saga and have been swallowing the propaganda, it was all about corruption, rebel bikie gangs, criminal elements, right? Infiltrating the Victorian and New South Wales construction union. Now, I've just noticed a very interesting case in Queensland where the Fair Work Commission, and let's not forget the CFMEU in Queensland, the construction branch of the CFMEU in Queensland, has never been involved in these corruption allegations. The Fair Work Commission has stopped them from taking a little bit of limited industrial action because they're bullying tactics. And it's fascinating. What I find is fascinating is these words, corruption to bullying. How legislation which is passed to protect individuals is then used to prevent organisations from taking workplace action because it comes under the title bullying, bullying. Is it a picket line? Bullying. Is an occupation? Bullying. Is a strike? Bullying. Is a delegate trying to get onto a site to service members of that particular union? Bullying. It looks like, although we had a Royal Commission 10 years ago, or over a decade ago into the construction branch of the CFMEU, that we're seeing the same tactics being used. Nobody's saying there's no corruption in the construction branch of the CFMEU, especially in the southern states. But the fact is, as I was speaking last week about the pylon, the CFMEU pales into insignificance in the way the financial sector, the aged care sector, and all these other, Royal Commissions we've had have treated segments of the community, the corporate sector, that have been responsible for some of the most crass, illegal activities, not even getting a slap on the hand. So again, we see this hypocrisy, If it's an organisation which acts in a way to resist and protect its members' interests, it's all about corruption. But if it's about some organisation which provides a services for a buck, which is out of control, it doesn't really matter, does it? They're too big. They're too big to fail, I should say. I got that wrong, didn't I? So think about the words corruption, bullying. Look at the robo-debt fiasco. Legalised theft. When people, it was illegal theft created by a government. Anybody is being prosecuted? No. But when it comes to CFMEU, corruption. But if there's no corruption, then it's bullying. All right? It's a little bit like, doesn't matter. It's a little bit like these virtual platforms, Now, I noticed that the, e-Safety Commissioner put out a little statement to the major players in the last 24 hours about if they don't behave, they're going to have a problem. But remember how the Catholic Church was taken to task, and correctly, in my opinion, taken to task for child abuse, and how it's paying the price in terms, not just in terms of its how it's viewed in the community, but in terms financially. Look at these virtual platforms. They allow child exploitation material to appear ad nauseum on their platforms. Because the thing is, with the algorithms on these virtual platforms, the more outrageous the conduct, the more eyeballs you've got, the more advertising you've got, the more profits you make. Because they only make a buck through advertising, these virtual platforms. So here we have the E-Safety Commission in Australia trying to, get them to regulate, take off this child exploitation material. And I'm talking about the grossest example of human exploitation you can think of. And they just merrily go on their ways, merrily making a buck. Could you imagine if the same charges were levelled against the CFMEU or any other organisation in this country? What would happen? But when it comes to these virtual platforms, nothing happens. Nothing ever seems to happen because they've been allowed to grow to be too big to fail. And that's the dilemma. What we've seen is the sovereign nation state being pushed aside, not just by these virtual platforms in the last decade or so, but pushed aside by corporations which are too big to fail. And that's one of the important dilemmas we face. Now, I was interested in our beloved Prime Minister, Mr Albanese. He's got a little tough road to, follow. And he said when Mr Biden, or President Biden, my apologies, yes, that was a heartfelt apology, I'm sure you could feel that. He said our relationship with the USA had grown from strength to strength. And it has grown from strength to strength. Because what has happened is we're on all the way with LBJ Mark II US imperialism dance. Because we've never had more United States troops stationed in this country since World War II. We've never had so many Australian military forces working in conjunction with United States military forces outside our borders since World War II. We now find ourselves in the situation through all the military-industrial contracts we've signed with United States armaments companies that our whole defence system is totally incorporated in the United States defence system. So instead of trying, as I said last week, instead of trying to form alliances with the people around us, we think that somehow the US of A, if we kowtow enough and doff our caps and get on our knees, will defend us in times of need. The reality is the United States has always been interested in their own people, which is fair enough. They walked out of Vietnam after 3 million Vietnamese dead. They walked out of Afghanistan. They've walked out of Iraq. Wherever they go, when the heat gets too much, they go away. Look at the poor people in eastern and northern Syria who are involved in the struggle against IS, who brought the Islamic State to its knees, with over 15,000 dead young men and women. What happened? The US never removed its terrorist, in inverted commas, label from these organisations and withdrew all support. So if we think that somehow, whether Mr. Trump is president or not, or whether Kamala Harris is president, that somehow the United States military is going to protect us in our hour of need, we need to think again, because in many ways we are being drawn into this proxy war. And what happens in proxy wars? It's the proxy states that suffer. So think about it. But we're all going to be saved. You know that? No, I'm not talking about God. Look, I feel sorry for God or the gods. I really do. I mean, everybody says they're on their side. And if I was a god, I'd be really pissed off, you know, about all these mortals somehow thinking that they can do what they like because, you know, I'm on their side. What a load of garbage. I mean, God, if she exists, must be shaking her head saying, what have I created? Because, you know, history is interesting. And it's a history of slaughter, mass slaughter. What's happening in Gaza is not unusual as far as human history is concerned. I mean, we love to wave the flag to the victor, but the reality is it's a nasty business living. But we're going to be saved. Mr. Dutton, the leader of the opposition, is going to save us. And he's going to save us because he's a smart boy. And he's a smart boy because he knows that in this country, if you press the right buttons and create enough fear, you can be bumped into Parliament. And if you look at the Liberal National Party policy as far as the federal election in May next year will be, and it is, it's creating fear. Fear of the asylum seeker. It worked. It worked for John Howard. Fear of the yellow hordes. It worked for Mr. Menzies. Fear, fear, fear. Fear of the Social Security beneficiary. Fear of crime. You name it. If there's an F in front of it, Mr. Dutton will be pushing that button. Because he knows, with the assistance of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, that he cannot go wrong. He cannot go wrong. Just press those buttons. Fear of economic insecurity. Why do we have economic insecurity? We're not going to talk about that, are we? It's all the Labor Party's fault, isn't it? It's not the fault of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. It's not the fault of the fact that all our mineral resources are in the hands of a limited number of corporations whose major responsibility is to create major profits for their major shareholders. No, it's not that. No. It's because of all these Social Security beneficiaries. Remember the good old days when it was, you know, you could bash a Social Security beneficiary? They were all losers, leaners, you name them. The Morrison government was very good at that, stoking that fear. So that's a dilemma we face as a society. Do we go down that true and tried path? Because it is a true and tried path. You stoke fear in the community. The community thinks that a strong leader, whether elected or self-appointed, is somehow going to save them, you know, from the hordes at the door. And Mr. Dutton is very good at actually promoting that type of ideology. Remember the good old days when it was all the fault of the Southern Sudanese in Melbourne that we couldn't go out to a restaurant? Remember the fear? Remember the fear regarding, all these Social Security beneficiaries? Now you've got the Chinese. That's always a good one. Never fear. Sorry for tautology. Never fear. Blame the Chinese. It's always good. Although they do say it's the Chinese Communist Party. They've forgotten that over 1 million Australians are of Chinese descent. They've forgotten that. So there's always the Russians. You can always blame the Russians. There's always the Martians. I haven't heard them being brought into the equation, but I reckon we should worry about the Martians. Forget about the Russians and the Chinese. I mean, there's the asylum seeker, there's the refugee, you name it. We should be fearful. Extraordinary. Extraordinary. You listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia of other community radio network. Look, if you find all this, depressing, don't worry. You can always join public interest before corporate interest. Go to pibci.net, pibci.net. You can join online. I mean, we're just a piddling little organisation, but at least there are people in this piddling organisation, ordinary people, who are willing to make extraordinary sacrifices in order to create change. So think about it. Now, talking about ordinary people making extraordinary sacrifices, I'd just like to look at the West Papuan situation. Now, West Papua is not Gaza, 10,000 kilometres from Australia. West Papua is 70 kilometres from Australia. Now, I have noticed the International Criminal Court has now just made a ruling, not that any ruling of the International Criminal Court means anything, because obviously who they defined as a war criminal, Mr. Netanyahu, is now addressing the Senate and the Congress and speaking to the President and the President in waiting. I mean, that's what being designated international war criminal gets you in 2024, especially if you're a supporter of the West. The free world, in inverted commas. I should say the corporate world. People talk about free trade, the free world. It's not free world. It's the corporate world. Now, West Papuan, they've been involved in independence struggle for over 7 decades. Over 7 decades. People die every day in that struggle. The Indonesian government hasn't been able to fully colonise West Papua, although it's working very hard at it. People die every day in West Papua in that independence struggle, not just through being, shot or tortured to death, but in terms of being slowly, killed through economic devastation. And I've been very proud to have been the coordinator of the West Papuan Rent Collective. And the West Papuan Rent Collective was formed in 2014 to create a space for West Papuan refugees and asylum seekers in this country, some who are now Australian citizens, to conduct their independence struggle. And over the last 10 years, the West Papuan Rent Collective has been paying the rent on an office which is used by the West Papuan Independence Movement at 838 Collins Street in Docklands, which acts as a focal point not just for West Papuan activity in Australia but internationally. It's become an important part of that international struggle for West Papuan independence. Now, while Palestinians have been able to get the International Criminal Court to declare that the occupation of Gaza, the East Jerusalem and the West Bank is illegal and that all settlements that have been created there since 1967 should be removed, as far as West Papua is concerned, very little has been done by the United Nations. About 10 years ago, the United Nations told Indonesia they were going to send a fact-finding mission to West Papua to actually look at the situation on the ground. But that mission, United Nations mission, has never been allowed into West Papua. And those of you who may remember the New Zealand pilot who was kidnapped by West Papuan rebel activists almost 2 years ago, I mean, the rebel activists have said they're quite happy to hand him over, but not to Indonesian authorities, but the United Nations authorities, and the West Papua and the Indonesian government has consistently refused to allow the United Nations to actually intervene. So here we have a struggle, a decolonisation struggle, that's what it is, that actually hasn't got the support and impetus it needs, especially from its nearest neighbour in Australia. And I know this is a little bit old, but I'll just go through this little story again because I think it highlights the extent of the marginalisation of the West Papua independence movement in this country. I think it was about a decade ago, a West Papuan supporter and activist was killed accidentally in a bicycle accident in Darwin. And a senator from a minor party, I think it was the old DLP, raised a motion of condolence in the Senate. And because the word West Papua was incorporated in that motion of condolence, both the government and the opposition, that was the Liberal National Party and the ALP, refused to support the condolence motion unless the word West Papua was removed. Now, I know that the Australian government has been working hand in glove with the Indonesian government in terms of training its elite forces in methods of guerrilla warfare, in arming the Indonesian military authorities in West Papua. And let's not forget, for every adult West Papuan male, there's about 250,000 in West Papua, there is one Indonesian troop. Could you imagine that? 250,000 Indonesian troops are stationed in West Papua. And as the Israeli Defence Forces are finding in Gaza, that when you are trying to suppress a movement which is struggling for its independence, which is struggling to get out of occupation, your chances of defeating that movement is nil, because of the almost universal support that movement has amongst the people in that specific geographical area. So, how can you help? Yes, we're always asking for help, aren't we? Well, you can join the West Papuan Rent Collective if you leave a message on 0439 395 489. I'll tell you how you can join. It's $1 a day, $365 a year. I think this year's a leap year, so it's $366. Simple. We pay the rent. We don't tell them what to do. We just pay the rent. We have no decision-making power. Our job is to provide the structures. Or, if you are in Melbourne, on Sunday the 4th of August, I invite you to come along to the Rent Collective gathering, which will be happening at the West Papuan office at 838 Collins Street in Docklands. Starts at 1 p.m. with a lunch. Come and enjoy a West Papuan lunch. Hear a few speakers. Listen to the speakers about why the West Papuan office here in Melbourne is so instrumental in the West Papuan independence struggle, especially in its bid to get the independence struggle heard on the United Nations General Assembly floor. So you're all welcome, 1 p.m. You can always, buy some things at the auction. Help the West Papuan. 10 years now we have been supporting the West Papuan office at 838. So go to 838 Collins Street, Docklands, then walk around to the back. There's a meeting room, barbecue area, gardens, the whole works. So come along, won't cost you anything. Come along, get involved, because ultimately, as far as West Papuan independence is concerned, and let's not forget that over 500,000 West Papuans have died directly and indirectly of that during that independence struggle. And I'm not talking about a population of millions of people, but a population of almost 1 million people. It's an extraordinary death toll. Deaths are still continuing. Let's not forget about the West Papuan independence movement. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Web pages you can go to, anarchistmedia.org, public interest before corporate interest. YouTube channels, public interest before corporate interest, Joseph Toscano, josephtoscano.nam, list goes on and on. Because you're on the net doesn't mean anything. What's important is if you get involved in things. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. Coming to you, my name is Joseph Toscano. This program has been coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. Listen to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station next week. And if you can't listen next week, don't despair. The program is podcast. 3cr.org.au.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
We know you love listening to 3CR, but we also know that many of you haven't downloaded the Community Radio Plus app yet.
The app lets you tune in anywhere and share the station with your friends.
So, show the love and share the love and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.